Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll profile and talk about Minneapolis sculptor Paul Olson. But first, our guest joining us now is Minnesota State University English professor Lynn Enger. Lynn, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
As we get started, tell the folks a little bit about yourself, your background, maybe where you're originally from.
Well, I grew up in Osakis, Minnesota, which is about halfway between Fargo and Minneapolis off I-94. Little town of about 1,300 people when I grew up in the 60s and 70s there. Good place to grow up. It's got a good big lake full of walleyes. Since 1993, I've been teaching English at Minnesota State University here in Moorhead. And so, I've been a teacher for, 32 years now. I started teaching high school. Since the early 90s, I've been teaching at the university. And I've been writing for a good share of those years. This is my second novel, The High Divide. And writing and teaching together are more than enough for me to handle.
Well, you got to it because obviously I didn't introduce it. That's what we're here to talk about today.
That's right.
Yeah, as the new book, your new novel that's out, you mentioned it, The High Divide. But before we get into that, what got you into writing and when?
Boy, I've been writing seriously since about 1984 or 5. And I grew up in a family full of storytellers. My grandfathers were storytellers. My parents are storytellers. So I grew up hearing their stories, and it just felt natural to me to want to write stories on my own. So I've been doing it probably since grade school. But I started seriously in my 20s, thinking I ought to try a novel. And it took me a long time to learn how to do it.
Well, all right, then tell us about your new novel, The High Divide, set in 1886 in the Upper Great Plains.
Yeah, it's set in territorial years before North Dakota was a state, before Montana was a state. I have been fascinated with the American bison for a long time, since I was a kid and heard about my great-grandfather shooting a bison that had wandered onto his land in southeastern North Dakota in 1884, a year after he homesteaded. And that was very close to the period where the bison were all but extinct in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. So for him to see one there, let alone shoot one, was pretty crazy. So I knew that bit of family history. And from that point on was interested in the animal. And then I came across a really interesting story that I had not heard before. And the story originates in Washington, D.C. in 1886. The curator of the Smithsonian Institute was a man named William Hornaday. And that spring, 1886, he was doing an audit of the museum, and he found out that he did not have one good specimen, that is, stuffed specimen, of the American bison. He also knew, because he was a conservationist, that animal was all but extinct on the North American continent. So what's he going to do? What he did was put together an expedition, a hunt, that took place in the fall of 1886 into Montana Territory. A hunt where he ended up finding and shooting some of the last wild bison on the continent. He did it so that he could preserve their memory in the museum. He also was aware of the irony involved, because he was a conservationist. And he did regret the fact that that animal was going to become extinct, he believed at that time. So I thought that was a great story. And I read about it, and I thought, man, I have to write a novel that at least incorporates that bit of history. And this novel doesn't start there. It starts with a family in western Minnesota. But the novel ends with that hunt. And so that's where the novel began. And of course, as a novelist, I like to make things up. I like to invent things. So William Hornaday is a minor character, and that hunt isn't at the front of that novel, but it does come into play.
Well, what kind of research goes into doing a book like this so that you can keep the accuracy of the times?
You know, I read a lot of books about that time. Another historical figure that comes into play in this book is George Armstrong Custer. And so I read diaries of soldiers who served with him. I read William Hornaday's accounts, of course, of that hunt that I referred to. I read novels from that period. One writer who I love, who I think is great, James Welch, who's a Blackfoot Indian from Montana, who wrote about this period from the Indian perspective, was very important in my understanding of the period, the time, what was happening in the Great Plains from 1865 to 1890. You know, so I just read everything I could get my hands on, and this happened over the period of years. I've been interested in this period and in the history of the plains, bison, the Indian tribes for a long time. So it's not as if I had to hurry up and do a lot of research to write this book, because I'd been doing it for some time. And of course I did research this book in particular. I did a lot of Googling. You know, when you're writing a novel, you're not just thinking of big events, you're thinking about questions like, what kinds of pencils did people use then? What kinds of mattresses did they sleep on? Because you're trying to create a sense of minute by minute daily life when you're writing a novel, as opposed to writing history. So the kinds of research you end up doing, it differs from the kinds of research a historian would do.
So how long did it take you to complete the book? I mean, I guess, I don't know if there's a start and end time, but I mean,
Yeah.
with all that research,
Yeah.
did you know that it was all for this book?
I did.
Okay.
I did. I knew what I was going to write. I started it in about, I think it was January of 2008. I wrote the first draft very fast. I finished the first draft by that summer, and then I revised for 4 years. For me, writing a novel is it's like sanding a floor. You know, you go over it once, you go over it again, you go over it again, and then you put on the finish. And by the time you put the finish on, you get the depth of the grains. So it's a slow process.
Interesting. Then I'll ask you more about that maybe off. It seemed like almost a natural fit for a movie. Did any movies inspire you, or anything research?
Well, let's see. I mean, I grew up watching westerns. You know, John Ford westerns, John Wayne westerns too. A recent movie that I loved was the remake of True Grit with Jeff Bridges. The Coen brothers directed that one. I thought that was marvelous. I'm looking forward to seeing The Homesman, which is out now at the Fargo Theater. I'm going to try to get to it. I'm probably have been more impacted by novels that I've read about the West. I love Cormac McCarthy's westerns. I mentioned James Welch. I think his historical, his period novels are wonderful. I like True Grit. I mean, there's any number of Alan LeMay wrote a western called The Searchers, which I thought was marvelous. So a lot of great American novelists have focused on the West. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your book a minute. Maybe the characters.
Yeah.
Specifically, maybe the mother and the two sons.
Sure. The mother is an immigrant from Denmark. Her name's Greta, and she married a man who's a Civil War veteran. His name is Ulysses Pope. She met him in St. Paul, where she had joined her aunt and uncle when she emigrated. So they met and married in St. Paul. Greta and Ulysses, they moved to Sloan's Crossing, Minnesota, at the far western edge of the state of Minnesota, and have lived there as the novel begins for 17 years. One day in the summer of 1886, her husband Ulysses goes off one morning to go build a chicken coop on the other side of town. He's a carpenter. And he doesn't return that night. That's where the book begins, with this husband and father of two boys. The boys are 16 and 11, not coming home. And of course, the family doesn't know what's happened to him. So the book begins in a moment of family crisis, a disappeared father and husband. This family, mom and two boys, are left trying to pick up the pieces. They don't have the economic resources to continue their life. They don't know where he's gone. And one after another, the family goes off in search of Dad. The boys first, they leave. They've gotten a little clue as to where he might have gone to, but they don't tell their mother. They go off, hop a train west in search of their dad. And Greta, the mother, thinks he's gone back to St. Paul, so she heads the other direction. So the book, in terms of structure, is a series of journeys, a search for a missing person. And I can't tell you how it turns out, but that's how it begins.
Well, that's, yeah, you don't want to give away the ending or nobody will read it. But how about you were going to read a passage for us? So
Yeah.
maybe we could do that right now.
I can do that. I'll read from chapter 1, the first couple of paragraphs. I don't think I need to set this up. It does follow the prologue, which describes the father's leaving. Mm-hmm. So chapter 1 is called His Father's Son. 6 weeks later, there had been no word at all, nothing. No reassuring telegraph from St. Paul or Minneapolis or some other city saying, "Things are well, don't worry." No letter describing the work he'd found and promising money to follow. The note he'd left was cryptic, cruelly brief. A chance for work, hard cash, was all it said, and Eli had managed to convince himself that was a reasonable explanation, a fair accounting. His anger had dissolved. He decided the loan his father took against their house, which caused such a stir between his parents, must have been necessary, and would not bring himself even to consider that his father might be gone for good, never mind how people talked, and despite the fears his mother couldn't hide. After all, who could say what kinds of trials and odd contingencies might come against a traveling man? When Eli was small, he'd often daydreamed his father's life, imagining the childhood spent on a farm at the edge of St. Paul, or the moment in the war that cost him his ear, a rebel cannonball, Eli fancied, or a bayonet. This labor of invention was necessary, since Ulysses never spoke of such things himself. But now, with his father not merely distant, but gone, Eli had been making up stories again. He could see him standing at the wheel of a Mississippi riverboat or perched on scaffolding high above the city, trowel in hand, as a building rose brick by brick into the sky. Or loading a freight car, sacks of potatoes riding both shoulders. Other times, though, at first light, or late at night under the stars, no image whatsoever came to mind. Only the sound of his father's voice, audible, close by. "I could use your help." That's how the book begins.
Well, now you mentioned some of the characters are made up and some are real.
Yeah.
Do you do that? I mean, is that the way a lot of people write novels like this, or?
Yeah, I think so. When it comes to historical fiction, you have to give yourself some room to maneuver. You know, I don't pretend to be writing history, but I hope I get the history right. I'm interested in history from the psychological perspective. I'm interested in the people that I've created, and in how historical forces and movements have impacted the people. And so, yeah, I think in order for me to do that, I have to feel I have a free hand in inventing these people and their complicated existences.
Mm-hmm. You commented about the book and about the destruction of the buffalo. Can you expand on that any?
Well, yeah, that's kind of how the story got started in my imagination, and as I started to think about how to develop the story, I realized I can't talk about the buffalo's disappearance without looking at what happened to the Indian tribes who depended on the buffalo for everything. So that's where the character of Ulysses comes in, because his family doesn't know at this opening that he also was in the Indian Wars, and he experienced things there in those battles that he is trying to cope with today. Today meaning beginning of the novel. And so this book, although it starts, in this very private kind of dilemma with the family, it takes on a lot of it takes on a very national narrative by its end, and not just environmental disasters, but human disasters that are very much a part of our history in the West, in this country. So it's a pretty, I think it's a pretty hard-hitting book by the end, and it was, it was for me pretty kind of a moment of reckoning to deal with some of those issues that I think our history courses don't really touch on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I enjoyed most about it was just immersing myself in the period, because I love that period of time, and I loved writing about it, and I loved imagining what this place looked like all those years ago, and journeying with my characters through it.
With that said, your brother Leif is
Yeah.
a successful writer.
Yeah.
What influence did he or other writers have on you?
Well, Leif and I, before we wrote our own novels, were writing mysteries together. So we kind of taught each other how to write fiction. And we used to plot these mystery novels together that we published with Pocket Books in the 90s. And then we would write and send each other chapters. So in revising each other's chapters, we kind of, sharpened our skills. And so Leif and I, for years, were writing as a team. And I benefited greatly from that. Greatly. Leif's a very, very good writer. And so I had a lot of fun working with him.
Well, we'll jump here to young writers. What advice do you have for them?
Read a lot. Read everything. Read a lot of good fiction, nonfiction. Read a lot of bad fiction and nonfiction. Establish an internal sense and sensibility of what makes a good story. You can only do that by reading.
Okay, so what's the reaction been to the book so far?
Very good. The critics have liked the book. It's gotten very good reviews. I was on about a 6-week book tour I went as far west as Denver, down to Texas, Florida, Boston. So I've read to a lot of people, met a lot of readers, and I can't complain about what the reviews have said. Most have been positive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Real quick though, are kids still reading? I mean, technology has changed such but are they still reading?
Kids are, as a teacher, people ask me, do kids write as well? Do they read as well as they used to? I would say they do write as well as they used to write. I think I don't wring my hands about contemporary students. I do think that they probably don't read as much as they used to in terms of what we think of as books. They read a lot online. They read all the time, but they probably don't read as many books as they used to.
Well, we're out of time.
Okay.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Stay tuned for more. Minneapolis sculptor Paul Osen has managed to make a career out of an art form he had no intention of going into. The Concordia College graduate has made many installations and pieces that are housed in buildings all over the Twin Cities. Here's a look at Paul's process and what he makes.
And I've gotten into pieces lately that move, that you can move them around. Kids like them a lot. But the kinds of things that I do have a lot of movement and negative space, and wood works really well for that. The original idea for the piece started with just some wire. Before doing it in wood, I made a mock-up in styrofoam, which then helped give me an idea where the pieces should be cut and how they should be glued together. But with more solid pieces, I'll often work with small bits of clay, just play around with them, and till I get a form that I like, and then I start working, trying to figure out how I can do it in wood. I usually have an idea going in what the wood form is gonna look like, rather than, I don't start with a block of wood and then try and find the sculpture within it. Doesn't work so well for me. I taught at Concordia for a couple of years in the English department. Got a master's degree in library science and did that. That's what I was doing in Chicago, and working in a network of medical libraries. I've never done this before. I've never taken an art class before. It'd be something different to do. It'd be also a way of meeting people in the classes and stuff. And so I started with the basics. You started with drawing and some printmaking, and then they gave us some clay, and then it was just like, oh, this is cool. And so for the 6 years that I lived in Chicago, I took art classes, all in sculpture. I do a lot of design work upstairs and outside, but when it comes to working with the wood, that's all down here, pretty much. When we first moved to Minneapolis in '79, I thought, and I had quit my job, and thought, well, I'll just do sculpture. And I went to a couple of art fairs, and it was like I didn't sell a thing, you know. I thought, well, this is not going to work out. This has been glued up. It's a different form. It's in two parts. It's going to be a treble clef. And I don't glue this last part together. I work them separately, sand them separately and everything until the very end, so that I can get in the interior and work on it without running into the other side. So I don't make a complete living at it. It's about half of my living. Never have enough claims. Once I got going a little further and got a little more experience and people became more interested, I started to sell a little bit. And then I had a couple of commissions from, these were people that are in the business of finding art for corporations and places like that, and that kind of got that going a little bit. That's why I keep doing art fairs, because I get that feedback. I only do a couple art fairs a year, and sometimes you can see it in their eyes, especially now with some of the pieces that I'm doing that have movement in them. You can see the little kid kind of come out, and kids play with them too, and I think, wow, that's really neat, that it means something to somebody else. And I've done pieces which were memorial pieces for people who had lost loved ones, and those pieces just really touched them, and that's really an experience for me. Use a mini grinder with a bit that does a lot of the carving for me. It's a great tool. I used to do hammers and chisels and stuff. I don't do much of that anymore. Well, it's interesting to get lost in a place that can be so messy, because it's dust all over the place. Sculpture is a physical process, and you get going just putting things together and shaping them, and the time just flies. Actually, for me, if I don't do it, if I'm away from my art for a while, it's like this. I've got to get back to it, and so I think that people that have that burning desire in them, they'll do it, and so my suggestion is, don't worry whether it sells or not, but do what you what you love. What I've found is if I try and make a piece of art to fit what I think other people want, it usually doesn't work. And so if I just play at and work on what turns me on, and it's successful, then usually it works for other people as well. And so I'm not sure. It's kind of magic in a way.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.